Good morning, Miss Livermore and class. Today I'll be discussing the idea of racism and how it is portrayed in today's media. I'll be showing you various texts from media outlets regarding different racist scenarios and highlighting the truth in these articles that best support my hypothesis, which is that the media have and will continue to portray a self-serving negative stereotype of race and are willing to show biased views that best suit their beliefs. Racism is defined by the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission 1998 as racism is an ideology that gives expression to myths about other racial and ethnic groups, that devalues and renders inferior those groups, that reflects and is enabled by deeply rooted historical, social, cultural, and power inequalities in society. Racism is an issue that has existed throughout all of the human history, and one that will never come to a complete end. It has been involved in the world media for centuries and started for us Australians when the first English settlers landed in Australia. Our society today is made up of a wide variety of groups. These groups of people have different cultural traditions, economical and social backgrounds. The success of communication and integrating of these groups depends largely on the attitude, values, and behaviours of people towards different groups. When you think of discrimination, racism is probably the first type we think of. The media has always incorporated and highlighted racism in their stories, and I will attempt to discuss the truth behind the media's views and investigate evidence that supports my hypothesis. The first issue of racism I am going to discuss will be racism that occurred in Australia. It has been a part of our past and is essentially linked to the history of colonisation and migration. The original owners of this land were the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They were evicted of their land and discriminated against by the first British and European settlers. The Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people believe the process of colonisation has been an invasion, and the racial discrimination has continued and will continue to influence the lives of Indigenous Australians. The media has always backed the negative side of the race war and has attempted to persuade people into believing that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are bad for the Australian society. In 2002, the movie Rabbit Proof Fence was released and confronted major issues that the media had on racism. The movie addressed the Australian policy of integration of mixed-race children. The plan was to integrate black and white people together in the hope to eventually taper off and kill off the black Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander race. The film, directed by Philip Noyce, is a true story, based on the book concerning the author's mother, as well as two other mixed-race Aboriginal girls who ran away from a settlement camp in Perth to return to their Aboriginal families. The film takes viewers on a journey, following the girls on their voyage back to their community, all the while being persuaded by the white people and an Aboriginal tracker. Rabbit Proof Fence criticizes the racist policy that declared all mixed-race children should be taken from their land and families and transformed to be made white. The film was directed to expose Australian racism's racist past and the consequences that the racist policy has had on the Indigenous people. It is only recently that Australia has officially recognised their wrongdoing and treatment towards the Indigenous community. In 2008, Kevin Rudd addressed the nation with his apology towards the Indigenous Australians called the Stolen Generation. The speech was aimed towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities as an expression of sorrow for the treatment their people received. The speech fronted the issue of the stolen generation, also known as the stolen children, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were removed from their families, the same issue that was discussed in the film Rabbit Proof Fence. The 1997 publication of the report, Bring Them Home, report of the national inquiries into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, brought a broader view of the stolen generation. The Stolen Generation was made nationally known and was backed by the media, whose views were originally against the Indigenous Australians. On March 3rd, 1991, Los Angeles police officers severely beat and then arrested Glenn Rodney King after pulling him over for a traffic violation in a residential area of Los Angeles. King, an African-American man, was intoxicated at the time and had disobeyed police orders when ordered to stay on the ground. Even after receiving 2 shocks with a taser, King continued to stand up, which led police to beat him with batons for nearly 2 minutes. All the meanwhile, an amateur cameraman caught the beating on tape and sent it to CNN. News stations across the United States played the video repeatedly. The 4 offending officers, according to the New York Times, claimed that they were scared and they felt they might have been attacked or harmed. Their fear is a sign of deep-rooted media bias that tells society that anything black is bad. The media has a stereotype of bad guys wearing black, or anything that is black is evil. This stereotype has been promoted for decades and is evident in movies where the bad guy who is committing crimes are always wearing black. This portrayal over time has created a false belief regarding the way we perceive and view blacks. What the media refuses to acknowledge is that the vast majority of blacks are employed, attend school, and are not involved in gangs or criminal activities. According to mass media and racism, it is now quite common for young black males to be stopped and questioned by police. This all plays back into the biased stereotype that the media portrays to us, and this stereotype will continue to be abused to make the black community be seen as the culprits. Everybody knows the famous quote, "I have a dream." These were the words made famous throughout the world by Martin Luther King, a famous civil rights activist. He did not believe it was fair that blacks did not have the same rights as whites, that blacks were treated extremely unfair. These are some of the examples of the unfair treatment the black community had to deal with. Separated drinking fountains, colored balconies in the movie theaters, and the mandatory seats in the back of the buses. Martin Luther King saw these as acts of cruelty and decided to take a stand and fight for his fellow black community. Mr. King, unlike few others, decided to do so, not using violence, instead calling several peaceful protests. This is one of the main reasons he became such a legend in the civil rights movement. I'm now going to discuss how news magazines like Time, Newsweek, and the US News went about distorting, neglecting, and then eventually praising him and his events. In order to help you understand the civil rights movement and its controversies, I will start from the beginning. King's first Civil Rights Act was to demolish the segregation policy, which was brought to his attention after the arrest of Rosa Parks. Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seats for a white passenger on the bus. Parks' arrest sparked protests to boycott the policy, and after a 382-day boycott led by Mr. King, the policy was brought to court. As the message came down from the Supreme Court that they had come to a ruling that the bus segregation was unconstitutional, this became a victory for King. After King's victory, there was almost nothing in Newsweek and Time. It wasn't until 382 days after the bus boycott began did Time and Newsweek report on the event. Both magazines predicted the black victory would be accepted by the white community. This was later proven untrue, as snipers fired shots at buses and homes of black ministers were bombed, and were black churches. King was first arrested as he tried to enter a courtroom where another black integration leader was testifying. Photos were published in Newsweek of a policeman handling King roughly. The caption of the articles noted, "Alabama rests a Negro minister on a loitering charge." King's name wasn't even mentioned. In the late summers of 1962, King decided to launch a series of demonstrations in Birmingham, which later led to the widespread violence. White police officers with canine dogs invaded the march and arrests were made. King was also one of those that were arrested. Time, Newsweek, and the US News and World Report all reported the events in Birmingham. Time and Newsweek wrote about the Birmingham campaign as a crusade for freedom. This was similar to Newsweek, however the writers chose terms like army, generals, and recruiting troops, and used these words to speak of invasion and military. The headlines of Newsweek and Time were unchanged as King's campaign continued. The turning point came when King recruited Birmingham school students, most of them teenagers, and sent them on a march downtown. Thousands of them were jailed. During the march, police officers chose to use clubs, police dogs, and fire hoses. More than 250 journalists from America and many other nations of Europe and Asia covered the story. Times, for example, described the scene as police against children, dogs against humans, whites against blacks. The US News described King as a sinister and ruthless leader, helping to mastermind the Birmingham protest and promising to add discrimination in a city that already had enough violence. On August 28, 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., an event occurred that united millions of blacks without violence. This is where King gave his forever famous speech, "I Have a Dream." The speech that captured millions worldwide. Time and Newsweek reported the march as a rite of national idealism. King popularity rose with time because his speech was catchy, dramatic, and inspirational. He became the civil rights leader who held the heat of most American Negroes. Months after the march, Time magazine was the first to print the entire "I Have a Dream" speech. US News described King as a false prophet and a dangerous radical who preached the requirements of social disruption. Time selected King as Man of the Year. Time said King was selected for his representation of his people, for whom 1963 was perhaps the most important year in their history. King was also honored by receiving the Nobel Peace Prize on December 10th, 1964. He was the 12th American and the 3rd Negro to win the prize. The victories and failures of Martin Luther King were many. In the beginning, Time magazine had refused to write anything about King and failed to mention his name. Newsweek wrote negatively about King and the Birmingham riots, stating that King had asked for violence by letting teenagers protest. After the Washington March, Time and Newsweek both reported the event in a positive way. In the end, Time made King its Man of the Year. The US News had called King ruthless and sinister, and the US News hardly printed anything positive. As you can see, King gained in popularity. Time and Newsweek gradually showed interest in his message, and their articles helped King gain the support from political figures and citizens. These cases of racism in Australia, America, and the world that I have discussed, along with the supporting evidence, all supports my hypothesis, which is that the media have and will continue to portray a self-serving negative stereotype of race, and are willing to show biased views that best suit their beliefs. It was seen in all three stories. The media showed their true views of the situation at the beginning. The media showed negativity towards the original owners of Australia, as well as towards Rodney King's bashing and Martin Luther King. However, the media finally changed their views that corresponded with society. If all of us make the stand just like Martin Luther King did, or stand up like Rodney King, we can make the effort together to finally stop racism in our world and not let race play as a factor. Thank you all for listening to my presentation.